Risotto is a dish that, to me, presents so much opportunity for creativity. Don't get me wrong, I love the classics that taste like garlic and shallot, butter, and white wine, but at its core, it's just rice that you cook in a specific way to give it that signature creamy, saucy texture. So why not make it taste like whatever you want? All right, so the first one I'm doing today is going to be a butter chicken risotto. I'm going to go through this one a little bit slowly so I can kind of explain my general decision-making process with risottos, but then I'll show you a couple more ideas that I'll go through a little bit more quickly. So this one's going to start with a whole bunch of garlic and ginger that I'm going to mince up pretty finely, and then I'm going to take about half of that and use it for the marinade for the chicken that I'm going to do. Here I have 2 boneless, skinless chicken thighs, to which I'm going to add half my ginger and garlic that's minced up, a couple big pinches of salt, a good amount of garam masala, and then some red chili powder, some turmeric, the juice of half a lemon, and then a couple spoonfuls of plain yogurt. So I'll mix that up, and once it's all evenly coated, I'll set it to the side while I get some other ingredients ready. This isn't going to get a lengthy marination time from me today. You could definitely do this step in advance if you want the chicken to marinate for longer, but I'm going to be cooking it with the marinade as well, so those flavors aren't going to have any problem making their way into the final dish, so I'm not that worried about it today. So now it's time for the first step of the actual risotto, and this is kind of the first step of any risotto, I think, is I'm going to prep my aromatics to start sweating in the fat. The aromatics for this dish are going to be the other half, the reserved half of the ginger and garlic that I minced up already, and then I'm going to do half of a red onion that I'll mince up pretty fine, and then I'm going to do 1 jalapeno, which similarly I'm going to mince up pretty finely. I think with just about any type of risotto that you're doing, you're going to want to mince up the aromatics pretty finely. If they're left in too big of chunks, they could throw off the texture in the end. So now into this wide, straight-sided stainless steel skillet, I'm going to melt 2 tablespoons of butter over about medium heat. And then once that's mostly melted, I'm going to throw in the onion and the jalapeno with a big pinch of salt. Salting the aromatics at this point will just help them release a little bit more moisture and help them break down a little bit more quickly. So I'm going to give those a couple minutes, and once the onions start to turn translucent, I'm going to throw in the garlic and ginger. I didn't do those up front just because I don't think they need as much time to get soft, so I held off on them for a little bit. And then once those are nice and fragrant, I'm going to hit that with probably a couple tablespoons, maybe 3 tablespoons of tomato paste. And along with the tomato paste, I'll throw in a couple more teaspoons of garam masala. So now once that all has a chance to fry up a bit and a fond is starting to form on the bottom of the pan, I'm going to throw in 1 cup of arborio rice and then stir that in to get it nice and coated with all the fat and all the aromatics, and to also toast it a little bit. And then once that gets a minute to toast, I'm going to deglaze this with just a little bit of unsalted chicken stock. I'm only adding a little bit up front right now, mostly so that I can still see the bottom of the pan and make sure I deglaze it properly. And I always use unsalted stock for this because it's going to reduce a lot, so if you don't use a sodium-free one, you could end up inadvertently making your risotto in the end unbearably salty. So once the pan is properly deglazed, I'm going to add probably another cup or 2 of chicken stock along with a pinch of salt and a little bit more of that red chili powder. It really doesn't matter how much stock you add at this point, as long as you don't add more than you're going to eventually need at this point. Usually for risottos, I use about 3/4 of a carton of stock. It kind of depends on how high your heat is, so how much evaporation you encounter, but that's my general rule of thumb, is anywhere from 3/4 to 1 whole carton of stock usually gets the job done for me. So now while I wait for that to come back up to a simmer, I'll get my chicken going. Like I said before, this only marinated for probably 5 or 10 minutes, but in this context, that's fine. For this preparation today, I like to get a lot of char on the chicken, so I'm gonna cook this under the broiler, not on the top rack, but on the second to top rack. If I put this on the top rack closest to the broiler, it would probably burn way too much before it cooked all the way through, but 1 rack down from that seems to work pretty well for me. So at this point, the rest of the risotto making process is pretty straightforward. I'm just gonna stand here and stir, and probably at about the 15-minute mark, I'll start tasting the rice to see how far along it is. Usually risottos like this take me about 20 to 25 minutes to cook from the time that the first dose of stock goes in. But again, that can be pretty variable depending on how hot your stove is and how much you're stirring. A lot of people at this point have debunked the idea that you have to stand here and stir risotto constantly for it to come out correctly. And that's true, you don't have to stand here and stir it constantly, but I still kind of like to stir it frequently because it does make it a little easier for me at least to visually gauge how things are coming along, and it also prevents things from sticking to the bottom of the pan. So every time it's starting to dry up in the pan, kind of like that, where it gets really thick, I'll taste the rice and see if it's done. If it's not done, add a splash more stock and just keep going. And I'm gonna keep doing that until it's cooked all the way through. Towards the end of the cooking process, I would say you do want to start adding smaller and smaller doses of stock as you go so that you can fine tune the texture of the final product and also the doneness level of the rice. So this is what the chicken looks like after about 8 or 10 minutes under the broiler. Like I said, I like a good amount of char on this, so that's looking perfect. So I'm gonna flip this over and keep going. The second side doesn't tend to take as long, probably just another 5 minutes on that. So at this point, the risotto is almost done, which is great because the chicken's almost done. When I taste the rice, there's still a little bit of crunchiness in the center of the grains, which a little bit of toothsomeness is good, kind of like an al dente pasta, but you don't want it to be crunchy, so make sure it's cooked all the way through. So there, the color on the chicken's looking good to me, and I'll check with a thermometer just to make sure it's cooked all the way through. Anything north of, I'd say 175 is good for chicken thighs. And yeah, this is definitely done. So I'm gonna take that out and I'm gonna pull it out of the pan just so it cools down a little bit faster. And I'm gonna try to spread on as much of that caramelized marinade as I can back on top of the chicken. All that stuff tastes great, so I want all of it. In terms of heat level for the risotto, you wanna cook it relatively gently, so you want it to be at a pretty even simmer the whole time. You never want it to get to kind of a ripping boil or anything. You just want it to be bubbling nice and gently throughout the entire process. All right, so after a final taste on this tastes pretty good. The rice is done, so this is good to go. I am gonna add just a little splash more of chicken stock just to loosen it up a little bit. When you're finishing the risotto in the pan, you want it to look looser than you want when eating it because it's going to tighten up as it cools. So if this looks a little too loose in the pan, by the time I get it out of the pan and into a bowl to eat, it's gonna be perfect. So now with the heat off, I'm gonna finish this with a little bit more fat, which is gonna be 2 more tablespoons of butter, because this is butter chicken after all, and then equally probably a couple tablespoons of heavy cream. I never measure the cream for this. I just figured that once it takes on that bright orange color, I've added enough. So that's it for the risotto. I'm just gonna roughly dice up the chicken, and then I'm ready to serve this up. So a couple big spoonfuls of that goes into the bowl, and then I'm gonna top it with some of this chicken, and then I'm gonna throw on a few torn cilantro leaves for good measure. And that is a very untraditional but very, very delicious bowl of risotto. This one was kind of my tester recipe. I wanted to see if this general idea or concept that I had would work, and this one worked out great. The texture came out perfect, the flavors were amazing. So now that this one worked out, I kind of understand the building blocks of what makes a good risotto. You have to sweat out your aromatics in some fat to start, and then toast your rice with that. Add your seasonings and your stock and stir it frequently. And then at the end, once the rice is fully cooked, turn the heat off and finish with a little bit more fat. So with those building blocks in mind, we can riff on this a million different ways. So now, let's do San Francisco style garlic noodle risotto. For this one, the aromatics are gonna be just a whole bunch of garlic. One of the keys to this dish, in my opinion, is that you use an unreasonable amount of garlic. So I'm using, I think, like 8 or 9 cloves, and honestly, I could have used more. So just like in the previous version, I'm gonna mince all of this garlic up really, really fine, and then I'm gonna get that sweating in some butter. Here, I'm going with 3 tablespoons of butter for this one. And while I wait for that, I'm gonna use some green onion for garnish for this one later, so I might as well chop that up as well. So once the butter is melted, I'm gonna throw the garlic in, and for this one, I'm going over probably medium-low heat. I don't really want to brown the garlic so much. I mostly want to infuse all of that butter with the garlic flavor. So medium-low heat for this one. Even though browning isn't really the goal with this one, it's okay if it takes on a little bit of color, and actually once it does start to take on a tiny bit of color, if it does, that's a good sign to throw in your rice to get toasting. So again, with this one, same as before, 1 cup of arborio rice goes in, and then once the rice has a minute to toast, for this one, I'm gonna deglaze with about a tablespoon each of soy sauce and oyster sauce. and then about 1 teaspoon of fish sauce. I haven't added any salt to this one yet, mainly because I just added a bunch of really salty ingredients. So once I start adding the stock, I'm gonna see where I'm at and then I'll adjust from there. Speaking of which, we got a fond building up there, so a little bit of stock goes in to deglaze, and once the bottom of the pan is clean again, I'm gonna add another cup or 2 of stock to get this going. So now at this point, the process is pretty much exactly the same. I'm just gonna bring this back up to a simmer and then keep stirring it as it comes along. After about 15 minutes, I'll start tasting the rice. And then for this one, when I'm about 5 minutes out, I'm gonna deal with my protein. For each of these ideas that I have here today, I'm gonna be pairing them with a protein. You definitely don't have to do that, but I like to do it. It makes it more of a complete dish, I think. So for this one, I'm doing some crab leg meat that I steamed and deshelled earlier. I'm just gonna saute that in a tablespoon of butter, and I'm gonna season it with salt, pepper, and Old Bay seasoning. And for this one, I basically just want to saute it until everything's warmed all the way through again, and maybe it has a tiny bit of color on it, but I'm not trying to take it too far or anything. So really all that needs is about 5 minutes. So at this point, the rice is done, and the risotto is looking a little bit thinner than I want it, which is perfect because it's still in the pan. So I'm gonna finish it this time with a big handful of Parmesan cheese that I grated on the microplane. And that's it for this one. If you've never had San Francisco garlic noodles before, I highly recommend you try them, whether in this version or the original just noodle version. It's a flavor that's unlike anything else I've ever eaten. It's super, super savory and rich. It's really unique and really, really delicious. And the crab pairs really well with the seafoodiness of it all. And you know, garnishes are always optional, but for this one, I think the freshness of the green onion really does help because the risotto is so savory and it's got such a deep flavor to it that the brightness and freshness of the green onion really, really helps balance things out. And that's it for this one. Another risotto that is exceptionally delicious. I'm 2 for 2 on the flavors today. Let's get a little more adventurous. Let's get a little filthier. Carnitas burrito risotto. This one sure sounds stupid, but I bet it's gonna taste good. Following the formula of the other ones, for this one, my aromatics are gonna be some white onion. I was gonna do half a white onion, but I had 3/4 of a white onion left over, so I'm using 3/4 of a white onion. Doesn't matter, you don't have to be precise with any of this. And along with that, I'm gonna do 1 jalapeno and a couple cloves of garlic. For the fat for this one, I'm just gonna use olive oil, and I'm gonna get the onions and jalapeno going first. Just like in the butter chicken risotto, those are gonna need a little bit more time than the garlic, so I'm gonna get those going first to get a little bit of a head start. Now, for the carnitas of the situation, here I have some chunks of pork shoulder that I braised the night before. I braised this with some garlic, some cumin, salt and pepper, I think Mexican oregano, some cinnamon, and some orange juice. Basically all I did was throw it all into a Dutch oven and then throw it into the oven at 275 for a couple hours until everything was kind of pork tender. So now all I have to do is put the finishing touch on it, and that's going to be to fry it in its own fat. So now I'm going to scoop all the meat out and put it into the skillet, and then I'm going to put the liquid into something a little taller and a little more narrow so that the fat will separate out easily. That way I can just ladle off the fat and get my carnitas frying. So at this point, my onions are translucent, so I'm going to go ahead and add my garlic, and in addition to that, I'm going to add some cumin and coriander that I ground up, a little bit of chili powder, and just a touch of tomato paste. Not as much as in the first one that we did today. It's mostly just here for the color, less the flavor in this one. And just like always, once that all smells great, I'm going to throw in 1 cup of arborio to get toasting. And then for this one, to deglaze, because I have it, I'm going to use the braising liquid from the pork. And now, once again, it's the same song and dance as before. I'm going to add a couple cups of stock and stir that and bring it back up to a simmer, all while keeping an eye on my carnitas this time, just to make sure they get the right level of browning on them. So just as before, I'm going to cook this over a medium heat to keep it at a steady simmer, and I'll keep cooking it until it gets pretty dry in the pan, at which point I'll add progressively smaller and smaller doses of stock until the rice is completely cooked all the way through. The carnitas are looking good now, so I'm going to turn the heat off of those and just set them to the side for now. And right about there, this one's looking done. The rice is cooked all the way through, and it's a little bit thinner than I want, which is perfect. And then once the cooking is completed for this one, I'm going to shut the heat off, and my finishing fat for this one is going to be a couple spoonfuls of Mexican crema and some shredded Oaxaca cheese. The Oaxaca didn't incorporate quite as well into the sauce. I thought it would just kind of dissolve and sort of disappear in there. It kind of left little streaks, but that's fine. For plating this one, just as before, I'm going to get a couple big scoops of that into the bowl, and then I'm going to hit it with some guacamole that I made earlier. And the guacamole is going to serve as a little landing pad for a few pieces of the carnitas. And then for garnish on this one, I like some chopped up cilantro and a squeeze of lime. This one is a lot more ridiculous than the first two I did, but I gotta say it tastes really, really good. I don't regret making this at all. It's delicious. But at the very least, I hope I've given you guys some ideas on how you can make your own custom risottos with whatever flavors you like. I'll leave the recipe for these 3 that I've showed you today in the description, but feel free to make up your own and riff on it however you want. If you do, let me know what you come up with and let me know how it goes. Thanks.